So we'll begin with historical perspectives on youth, starting all the way from the Middle Ages to the period of Enlightenment. So we'll start with the Middle Ages perspective on youth, and this will cover medieval Europe in around the 5th to the 14th century, so from the 600s to the 1500s. Under this perspective, the viewpoint was that children were born evil, and this was linked to original sin. So going all the way back to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and eating the apple, and that's where humans were initially viewed as, okay, they're innately bad. Humans are born with sin, they're born with this evilness, and we need to weed the evilness out of people. What we saw during this era is the predominance of the Catholic Church over all facets of life. It wasn't as if there was this church and then there was a state, we had the economy, we had agricultural perspectives, we had education ministers, not like Canada's different ministries and departments today. The Roman Catholic Church was the economy. It was the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Finance. It was everything, including presiding over how to respond to persons involved in crime. So at this point in time, the Catholic Church viewed children as miniature adults. There was no need to separate children from adults in terms of a unique developmental stage. So there wasn't a lot of writings, obviously, at this time. The 90%, 95% of people did not know how to read or write. But artwork can tell us the story of how youth were viewed at this point in time. During this time period, one of the best indicators of how age didn't matter is that age was never recorded in official documents. We think now about how the focus will be on when somebody was born, when somebody died, at what age they accomplished these different things. In the medieval ages, people didn't even record the age somebody was when they passed away. There was ideas of birth dates, milestones. These things were not actually applicable to this age stage. Artwork is really useful for telling the story of how youth were viewed during this era. One of the things or key terms to know when talking about the Roman Catholic Church was that they had hegemonic power over society. So what does hegemonic mean? It essentially means that the church has total control over the flow of information, that there is no alternative perspective to the church. The church communicates information to people, and people consume that information, and that's the only way that information is transmitted. Society got their knowledge from the church and from nowhere else. So you can see a lot of odd pictures in this slide here. You've got different photos of kids that are dressed like adults. They're in stiff clothing, stiff postures. They're not playing. They're not doing anything other than sitting. And so the idea here is that children are just viewed as these miniature adults. They're being raised to become the adult that they're viewed as. The next era that we'll talk about after the Middle Ages is the Reformation era, from the 14th to the 16th century, where we see a decline of the Roman Catholic Church, specifically in terms of judicial power and philosophy. This doesn't mean that the Roman Catholic Church declined in other ways. Everybody still believed in the Catholic Church. We began to see the Catholic Church's grasp on the judicial power and sort of rule over criminal behavior begin to decline. We saw this Puritan doctrine where children were born evil and stubborn and had to be civilized towards destiny or virtue and salvation. So again, at this time still, we hadn't moved to that corruption phase of society ruining the purity of adolescents and children, but we are beginning to see the shift away from the Catholic Church. We see harsh and restrictive child rearing practices as the best way to tame the child's wild behavior. So children that did go to school were sort of viewed as disobedient, and schoolmasters would beat these children as a way to teach them to no longer be disobedient, to try and tame the wild child. Just because the Roman Catholic Church wasn't also acting as the court system, it did obviously promote religion and morality, and this had an influence on how people viewed the best way to raise children, to make sure that they were self-reliant and had self-control. Age of discovery perspective that took place around the 16th to 17th century saw a very slow change in Western Europe in terms of a move from agrarian feudalism. So people lived on farms, they worked as serfs. This land that they farmed was owned by a lord or somebody else other than them. Nobody owned their own land. To mercantilism, where there was usually meant there was a single corporation passed down or dictated by the government or the church that was responsible for running a particular business or a particular enterprise. And during this stage, poverty was rampant. Delinquency became a growing problem. There was a new class of young vagrants and beggars, and some viewed this as a sort of a loss of the agrarian roots. It used to be that family was more closely knit, but because they would work together on the farms and things like that. But when we move towards this mercantilism and towards this industrial revolution, children's labor is no longer needed. Children used to work, for example, as apprentices, and they would carry water for workers in the fields, and this would give them something to do. As technology advanced and as work became a little bit more requiring skill or working in factories, children were not necessarily needed anymore. And so that means that they were kind of wayward. And this is where the delinquent behavior began to be recognized by people. There were kids out in the street who had nothing to do. And this is where the terms of delinquency really began to emerge. The Enlightenment perspective on youth in the 18th century was really key for especially reducing the church's control over society. New philosophies about reason and emphasis on human dignity, respect, and free will began to emerge. So keep in mind, in the past, children were thought of as being born evil, that the reason why they engaged in criminal behavior, delinquent behavior, was the result of demonic possession. Now we're beginning to see Greek and Roman schools of thought begin to spread, and again, it all has to do with Johannes Gutenberg and the printing press. It also has to do with trade. So as especially Greek and Roman countries began to learn the value of trade, the value of travel to new lands, to learn from other people, but more likely to steal from other people, resulted in new ideas emerging and spreading throughout different countries that otherwise wouldn't have had any communication with each other. So we begin to see this increased focus on science over religion. We're no longer just seeing people farm land. New technologies are developing. This travel and writing down notes and recording stories basically results in the creation of literature and the creation of new ideas. So this figure is really meant to just try and show everybody how slow progress was in changing perspectives, and then how quickly perspectives changed over time. So if we start sort of at 1 BC or 1 before the Common Era, we thought of criminal behavior, or everybody believed in this idea of original sin. And then when we move through the Common Era, we took 100th century, 200th century, all the way up until about the 17th century, midway through the 17th century, that people began to have different perspectives on the idea of how people are innately born. So we move away from this idea of original sin. What we see in the mid-1600s is Thomas Hobbes wrote that people are born evil, but did not really believe that this evilness was the result of the Roman Catholic Church's belief in original sin. It wasn't that they were born with sin, it's just that humans were innately evil, and that's why we have these social contracts to try and stop people from moving towards their innate evilness. Thomas Hobbes doesn't really shake things up totally, but he begins to just say that, hey, it's not just the church's ideas are what we have to believe in. John Locke was very key, and this happened only about 30 years later from Thomas Hobbes, but John Locke was very key in completely changing the viewpoint of people. Instead, Locke said that no, people are born neither good nor evil. They're born as a blank slate. So this huge shift from the Roman Catholic Church, huge shift from Thomas Hobbes and this idea that people are born evil. This blank slate notion becomes hugely important for contemporary criminological theories like social learning theory. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, about 10 years after Locke, said people are actually born good. And as I mentioned earlier in the class, it's that people are corrupted by society. It's society that is corrupt, and that's why people begin to involve themselves in criminal behavior. We can see these ideas influence Emile Durkheim when he was talking about anomie and how the state of society is going to impact individuals' involvement in criminal behavior. We can look at more contemporary theories like Agnew strain theory, where things happen to somebody and that is why they engage in criminal behavior. So this marks the big difference between control theories, which try to explain why people do not engage in criminal behavior, i.e. something happens to them to stop them from involving themselves in criminal behavior, and consensus theories. And consensus theories are those which say that people are basically born good or born as blank slates, and something in their environment changes in a way that influences their involvement in criminal behavior. But at the same time as Jean-Jacques Rousseau was Cesare Beccaria. And Beccaria basically said that man is calculating. They are able to perform that hedonistic calculus, balancing pleasure versus pain. And they will engage in behaviors that will bring pleasure and minimize pain. And this is where fundamental principles of our current justice system are still based on. The idea that through punishment, through the codification of criminal laws, we will be able to deter individuals from engaging in crime because the rewards, i.e. the pleasure, will not outweigh the pain, i.e. the punishment. So for like 1500, 1600 years, there was a single idea. And then within the span of 50 years, or 100 years, there was now all these different perspectives. Some are saying that children are still born evil. Some are saying that children are born neutral. Others are saying that children are actually born with a sense of morality and that it's society that corrupts everyone. So keep these different ideas in mind when we're going through the different theoretical perspectives of youth offending that we talk about in this class.